The crisp autumn morning painted Chicago's skyline in brilliant shades of orange and pink as commuters rushed to catch their trains. The Richardson Street station was bustling with its usual crowd, a mix of suits, students, and service workers, all fighting the Monday blues with steaming cups of coffee in their hands. Among them stood a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in what looked like a $1,000 business suit, her heels clicking impatiently against the platform as she checked her watch for the third time in 2 minutes. Her perfectly styled hair and designer handbag screamed corporate executive, but her face wore the kind of scowl that made other passengers instinctively step away. The 8:15 train rolled into the station right on schedule, its doors opening with a soft hiss. The woman pushed her way through the crowd, muttering under her breath about people who didn't know how to move quickly enough. Inside, the train car was packed tighter than usual. Someone mentioned something about delays on the Blue Line forcing more people onto this route. She made her way down the aisle, her expression growing increasingly sour as she realized most seats were already taken. The few empty spots were next to people she clearly didn't deem worthy of sharing space with. Her nose wrinkled as she passed a young mother trying to quiet her baby, and she rolled her eyes at a group of construction workers discussing their upcoming project. The woman clutched her expensive handbag closer, as if afraid it might catch something from the common folk around her. Her eyes darted around the car, searching for what she considered an acceptable seat. The train lurched forward, almost making her lose her balance, which only added to her visible frustration. A businessman in a sharp suit offered her his seat, but she ignored him completely when she noticed he had an accent. The other passengers watched this displayed with a mixture of disbelief and disapproval, some shaking their heads, others whispering to their seatmates about her behavior. Near the middle of the car, there was an empty seat next to a distinguished-looking man in judicial robes who was deeply focused on a stack of legal documents. The seat seemed perfect, clean, spacious, and next to someone who clearly shared her professional status. But as she approached and got a better look at who would be her seatmate, her entire demeanor changed. The woman's face contorted into an expression of obvious displeasure. She stood there, gripping the overhead rail, making no attempt to hide her prejudiced grimace. The other passengers could sense what was coming. The air in the train car grew thick with tension as they waited for what this woman would do or say next. Little did she know, her next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would change her perspective forever. The universe has a funny way of teaching lessons to those who need them most, and on this ordinary Monday morning, an extraordinary lesson was about to unfold. The gentle sway of the train and the muffled conversations of other passengers faded into the background as she prepared to make a decision that would come back to haunt her in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The next few minutes would prove that karma doesn't always take its time. Sometimes it works on an express schedule. The executive woman stood there, her knuckles white from gripping the overhead rail, as if touching the empty seat would somehow taint her designer outfit. The distinguished man in judicial robes continued reviewing his documents, his calm presence a stark contrast to her growing agitation. Several passengers watched the scene unfold, their morning commute suddenly becoming more interesting than their phone screens. "Excuse me," she called out loudly, her voice cutting through the usual train noise. The conductor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying temples, made his way through the crowded aisle. He'd been doing this job for 20 years, but something in her tone told him this wouldn't be a typical morning complaint. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" he asked professionally, though his expression suggested he'd already guessed what was coming. The woman's response was immediate and dripping with entitlement. "I paid good money for my ticket," she announced, loud enough for half the car to hear. "I shouldn't have to stand here like some second-class citizen. I need a proper seat." Her eyes darted meaningfully to the empty spot next to the judge, then back to the conductor, her implication clear as day. The conductor glanced at the empty seat, then at the judge who remained absorbed in his work, his dignity intact despite the growing spectacle. "Ma'am, there's a perfectly good seat right there," the conductor said, gesturing to the empty spot. "You can't be serious," she scoffed, raising her voice even louder. "I'm not sitting next to, well, you know what I mean." She gave a dismissive wave toward the judge, who continued reading his documents as if he couldn't hear her words. A young woman sitting nearby gasped audibly. A group of college students a few seats away started recording the incident on their phones, their faces a mixture of shock and disapproval. An elderly gentleman in a tweed jacket stood up, leaning on his cane. "Young lady," he said firmly, "I fought in 2 wars alongside men of every color and creed. They were all heroes. Your behavior is disgraceful." His words carried the weight of wisdom and experience, but the woman merely rolled her eyes. "Mind your own business," she snapped back. "I have rights. I demand to be moved to a more suitable location." She emphasized the word suitable while shooting another disgusted look at the judge. The conductor's friendly demeanor hardened slightly. "Ma'am, this is public transportation. Every paying customer has the right to sit wherever they choose, and every customer deserves to be treated with respect." Other passengers began voicing their support for the conductor. A mother covered her young daughter's ears, shaking her head in disappointment. 2 businessmen in suits similar to the woman's moved away from her, clearly embarrassed to be associated with such behavior. The judge finally looked up from his papers, but instead of anger or hurt, his face showed only patience and composure. His calm demeanor seemed to frustrate the woman even more. He was someone she looked down upon, yet he carried himself with more dignity than she could muster in her expensive outfit. "This is ridiculous," she declared, fumbling in her designer bag. "I want to speak to your supervisor. I'll have you know I'm an executive at—" Her voice trailed off as her phone started ringing. The screen showed a number from the downtown courthouse. The other passengers watched as her face changed colors, from red with anger to slightly pale with worry. She answered the phone, turning away from her audience, but everyone could still hear her end of the conversation. "Yes, this is she. What? But that wasn't supposed to be until—" "Yes, I understand, but 10 minutes? That's impossible. I'm still on the train and yes, I'll be there as soon as I can." She ended the call, her hands shaking slightly as she dropped her phone back into her bag. The universe, it seemed, had perfect timing. The woman who moments ago had been so vocal about her rights now stood in silent panic, realizing she had wasted precious minutes creating a scene instead of simply taking a seat. The train continued its journey downtown, the gentle sway of the cars now accompanied by hushed whispers and meaningful glances among the passengers. The judge returned to his papers, but a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. Sometimes, karma doesn't need to lift a finger. People create their own consequences. Little did the woman know, her morning was about to get much more interesting. The next stop was approaching, and with it, a twist of fate that would teach her an unforgettable lesson about judging others based on appearances. The distinguished judge maintained his composure as he continued reviewing the morning's case files, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. His well-worn leather briefcase sat beside him, filled with important documents for the day's proceedings. Despite the woman's offensive behavior, he showed no sign of distress or anger, just the quiet dignity of someone who had faced such prejudice before and risen above it. Several passengers who had witnessed the scene were still watching him with a mixture of admiration and sympathy. A young law student, recognizing the judicial robes, couldn't help but lean forward in her seat, trying to catch a glimpse of the nameplate partially visible on his briefcase. Her eyes widened as she realized exactly who this distinguished man was. "Oh my goodness," she whispered to her friend. "That's the federal judge who made headlines last month for his landmark decision on civil rights. He's one of the most respected legal minds in the state." Her friend looked impressed, then angry as she thought about how the woman had treated him. The judge glanced up briefly, offering a gentle smile to the law student before returning to his work. He'd spent decades building his reputation not just as a legal expert, but as someone known for his fairness and impartiality. Even now, as he reviewed the documents for today's discrimination case, he showed no sign that the morning's incident would affect his judgment. An elderly nurse on her way home from the night shift stood up from her seat across the aisle. "Sir," she said softly, "would you like my seat? You shouldn't have to sit next to where that woman was standing." The judge looked up, his eyes twinkling with kindness. "Thank you, but I'm quite comfortable here," he replied warmly. "Besides, I believe everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow from their experiences." His voice carried the weight of wisdom earned through years of observing human nature from the bench. A businessman who had been pretending to read his newspaper finally spoke up. I can't believe you stayed so calm, sir. If someone had treated me that way, he shook his head, unable to finish the thought. The judge carefully arranged his papers before responding. In my years on the bench, I've learned that true justice isn't about revenge or getting even. It's about upholding the law fairly for everyone, regardless of their personal beliefs or prejudices. A group of high school students who had been recording the incident on their phones were now frantically Googling on their devices. One gasped as she found an article about the judge's recent achievements, his work on civil rights cases, his mentorship programs for underprivileged youth, and his reputation for absolute fairness in the courtroom. The conductor passed through again, pausing beside the judge's seat. "Sir, I want to apologize for what happened earlier. If there's anything we can do." The judge raised his hand gently. "No apology necessary. You handled the situation professionally. Sometimes the best response to ignorance is simply to let people's actions speak for themselves." A mother holding her young daughter approached the judge tentatively. "Sir, would you mind if I told my daughter about what happened today? I want her to learn from your example how to respond to hatred with dignity." The judge's face softened as he looked at the little girl. "Young lady," he said kindly, "always remember that your character is shown not in how others treat you, but in how you respond to that treatment." The train continued its journey downtown, but the atmosphere in the car had changed. Passengers who normally spent their commute buried in their phones were now engaged in quiet conversations about justice, dignity, and the power of maintaining one's composure in the face of prejudice. What none of them knew, not even the judge himself yet, was that the woman's hasty exit from the train was leading her directly to his courtroom. The universe had an interesting way of bringing things full circle, and today's circle was about to close in a way that would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved. The judge checked his watch and began gathering his papers. His stop was approaching, the federal courthouse where he presided over cases for the past 15 years. As he organized his briefcase, a small smile played across his face. Years of experience had taught him that justice often had its own timeline, and today's timeline was about to get very interesting indeed. The train screeched to a halt at the next station, and the executive woman practically flew out the doors, her designer heels clicking frantically against the platform. The urgency of her courthouse phone call had completely changed her demeanor. Gone was the arrogant stance, replaced by barely concealed panic. She rushed up the station stairs, nearly colliding with a street vendor setting up his morning coffee cart. "Watch it," she snapped, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Her perfectly styled hair was starting to come undone in the morning breeze, and beads of sweat were forming on her forehead despite the cool autumn air. Fumbling with her phone, she tried calling her law firm's office. Pick up," she muttered, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk while trying to hail a taxi. The morning traffic crawled by at a snail's pace, every red light feeling like an eternity. "This is a disaster," she said to herself, checking her watch again. The discrimination case she was supposed to defend was one of the biggest in her firm's history. Her company stood accused of systematically passing overqualified candidates based on their race, and she was supposed to convince the judge that their hiring practices were completely fair. A taxi finally pulled up, and she practically dove into the backseat. "Federal courthouse, and I'll pay double if you can get me there in 5 minutes." The driver looked at her through the rearview mirror, taking in her disheveled appearance. "Lady, I can't break traffic laws, but I'll do my best," he said calmly, pulling into traffic. She slumped back against the seat, trying to collect herself. Opening her briefcase, she realized in horror that in her rush to get off the train, she'd left behind one of her most important files. The taxi driver watched through his mirror as she frantically dug through her bag, papers flying everywhere. "Rough morning?" he asked sympathetically, navigating through the downtown traffic. "You have no idea," she replied without looking up. "My whole career could be riding on this case, and now everything's falling apart." For the first time that morning, her voice carried a note of vulnerability instead of entitlement. As they waited at a red light, a group of law students crossed in front of the taxi, carrying their textbooks and chatting excitedly. "I heard we're getting to sit in on a big discrimination case today," one of them said. "They say the judge is amazing, totally fair and unbiased." The woman's stomach churned as she overheard their conversation. Just an hour ago, she'd been so confident, so sure of herself and her position in the world. Now, karma seemed to be catching up with her at lightning speed. The taxi turned onto the courthouse street, and she could see reporters gathering on the steps. This case was bigger than she'd realized. It wasn't just about her company anymore, it was about fundamental questions of fairness and justice. "That'll be $20, the driver said as they pulled up to the courthouse. She handed him $50 without counting, her mind already racing ahead to the courtroom. As she hurried up the steps, she nearly tripped, her usual graceful stride abandoned in her rush. Inside the courthouse, she rushed past the security checkpoint, her heels echoing through the marble hallway. Legal assistants and clerks dodged out of her way as she practically ran toward the courtroom, checking her phone one last time. The message from her firm flashed on the screen, "Judge reassigned last minute. Very respected, known for tough stance on discrimination cases. Don't mess this up." She paused outside the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 302, trying to catch her breath and straighten her suit. Through the doors, she could hear the bailiff's voice. "All rise for the honorable judge." Her hand froze on the door handle as a sudden, terrible thought struck her. But it couldn't be, could it? The universe couldn't be that ironic. She pushed open the door, about to learn exactly how karma sometimes works on an express schedule. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and the executive woman stepped into what felt like a scene from her worst nightmare. The room was packed, reporters with their notepads, law students eager to witness a landmark case, and civil rights activists who had been following the lawsuit for months. Every head turned to look at her as she entered, but she barely noticed them. Her eyes were fixed on the bench, where the distinguished man from the train now sat in full judicial regalia. The same man she had refused to sit beside less than an hour ago was now holding her career in his hands. The blood drained from her face so quickly that a nearby court clerk actually took a step forward, worried she might faint. "All rise." The bailiff called out again, and she found herself standing on wobbly legs. The judge's gaze swept across the courtroom, professional and impartial. When his eyes met hers, there wasn't a hint of recognition, just the steady look of a man who had spent decades ensuring justice was served fairly. She fumbled her way to the defense table, nearly dropping her briefcase. Her junior associate, already seated, gave her a concerned look. "Are you okay?" he whispered. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She couldn't find the words to respond. The judge began his opening remarks, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had shown on the train. "This court will now hear the case of Williams versus Metropolitan Corporate Holdings regarding allegations of systematic discrimination in hiring practices." He paused, looking directly at the attorneys. "I trust both sides are prepared to proceed." The opposing counsel stood confidently. "Yes, Your Honor." All eyes turned to the executive woman, who seemed to have temporarily lost the ability to speak. Her associate had to gently nudge her before she stumbled to her feet. "Ah, yes, Your Honor," she managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. A few people in the gallery exchanged confused looks. This wasn't the confident corporate defender they'd expected to see. The judge nodded, showing no sign that he'd ever seen her before. "Very well. Counsel for the plaintiff, you may present your opening statement." As the opposing lawyer began speaking, presenting evidence of the company's discriminatory practices, the woman found herself unable to focus. Her mind kept replaying the scene on the train, her loud complaints, her entitled demands, her blatant prejudice. Each memory felt like another nail in her career's coffin. She watched as the judge took careful notes, his attention fully focused on the facts being presented. The same hands that had held legal documents on the train now wrote observations that could determine the outcome of this case. The same ears that had heard her bigoted remarks were now listening to evidence about her company's treatment of minorities. A law student in the gallery suddenly covered her mouth, her eyes wide with recognition. She whispered something to her classmate, and soon a wave of hushed whispers spread through the courtroom. Several people who had been on the train were in the gallery, and they had just made the connection. The executive woman felt sweat beading on her forehead as she watched more and more people lean in to whisper to their neighbors, some pointing discreetly between her and the judge. Her associate noticed the murmurs too. "What's going on?" he whispered. "Do you know why everyone's whispering?" She couldn't answer. Her throat felt too dry, her heart pounding too hard. The judge continued as if nothing was amiss, maintaining the perfect professionalism he'd shown on the train. but now that composure felt less like a comfort and more like the calm before a storm. The opposing counsel finished their opening statement, and the judge turned toward her table. "Counsel for the defense, are you ready to present your opening statement?" She stood on shaking legs, her carefully prepared notes suddenly seeming woefully inadequate. How could she stand here and argue that her company didn't discriminate when the entire courtroom had just learned about her own prejudiced behavior? The irony was almost too much to bear. As she opened her mouth to speak, she caught a glimpse of the train conductor entering the back of the courtroom. He had come to watch after his shift, not knowing he was about to witness karma unfold in real time. Standing before the court, the executive woman's usual confidence had evaporated like morning dew. Her hands trembled as she shuffled her papers, desperately trying to focus on the opening statement she'd practiced countless times. The judge waited patiently, his expression neutral and professional, showing no trace of their earlier encounter. "Your Honor," she began, her voice barely audible. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Your Honor, my client, Metropolitan Corporate Holdings, has a long-standing commitment to fair hiring practices." The words felt hollow in her mouth, especially under the steady gaze of the judge she'd so recently disrespected. From his position on the bench, the judge began his careful questioning. "Counsel, could you explain your client's current diversity statistics?" His tone was perfectly measured, exactly as professional as one would expect from a federal judge. If anything, he seemed to go out of his way to treat her with extra fairness. She fumbled through her documents, growing increasingly flustered. "Well, Your Honor, our statistics show," she paused, realizing the numbers in front of her actually supported the plaintiff's case rather than her defense. The courtroom remained silent, waiting. A young intern rushed in with updated employment records, passing them to her associate. The papers showed years of qualified candidates being passed over, their resumes relegated to the bottom of the pile for reasons that seemed increasingly questionable under the harsh light of judicial scrutiny. "Counsel," the judge continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience, "could you address the disparity between your client's stated hiring policies and these employment records?" He held up a document that showed a clear pattern of discrimination. The woman glanced at the gallery, where the train conductor sat watching the proceedings with great interest. Next to him, several passengers from the morning commute had filed in during their lunch break, drawn by the irony of the situation. Their presence made each of her attempts to defend discriminatory practices feel like a fresh indictment of her own behavior. "Your Honor," she tried again, "these statistics don't tell the whole story." But as she spoke, memories of her own words on the train kept interrupting her thoughts. How could she argue against discrimination when she'd so clearly displayed her own prejudices just hours before? The judge leaned forward slightly. "Counsel, are you familiar with the Robertson case from 2019? His question was precise, designed to expose the flaws in her argument rather than her character. How does your client's position differ from the precedent set in that decision? She wasn't prepared for this line of questioning. Her mind kept jumping between the legal arguments she needed to make and the memory of her entitled behavior on the train. The judge's professional demeanor only highlighted how poorly she had behaved in comparison. Her associate noticed her struggling and tried to help by passing her relevant case files, but her hands were shaking too much to hold them properly. Papers scattered across the defense table, creating a visual metaphor for how her case was falling apart. The judge continued his methodical examination, each question revealing another layer of inconsistency in the company's practices. "Could you explain why candidates with nearly identical qualifications had such dramatically different interview outcomes?" He wasn't being harsh or aggressive. His calm professionalism made the truth impossible to hide. In the gallery, the law students who had witnessed the train incident were furiously taking notes. This wasn't just a discrimination case anymore. It was becoming a lesson in how justice works, how true professionalism looks, and how karma sometimes delivers its lessons from the bench. The woman watched helplessly as the judge systematically dismantled each of her prepared arguments. Not through anger or retribution, but through careful, precise questioning that revealed the truth. His robes no longer seemed like just a uniform, they were a symbol of the justice she had mocked that morning. As the afternoon wore on, the courtroom became increasingly warm, but the judge remained cool and composed. The same dignity he had shown on the train now commanded the entire courtroom. With each question, he demonstrated why he had earned his reputation for fairness, even to those who had shown none to him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courtroom's tall windows as the judge prepared to deliver his ruling. The executive woman sat at the defense table, her earlier arrogance replaced by quiet reflection. The gallery was packed. Morning commuters, law students, reporters, and civil rights activists all waited in hushed anticipation. In the case of Williams versus Metropolitan Corporate Holdings, the judge began, his voice carrying the same measured tone he'd maintained all day. This court has carefully reviewed all evidence presented. He adjusted his glasses, the same ones he'd worn while reading on the train that morning. The woman found herself studying his face, seeing it properly for the first time. The lines around his eyes spoke of wisdom earned through years of service. The steadiness of his hands as he reviewed his notes showed the confidence of someone who had dedicated his life to justice. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of discriminatory practices spanning several years, he continued. The defense's argument that these were isolated incidents does not stand up to scrutiny. His words were firm but fair, focused entirely on the facts of the case rather than the morning's events. In the gallery, the train conductor nodded silently. Next to him, the elderly passenger who had stood up to the woman that morning wiped away a tear. They weren't just watching a verdict being delivered. They were witnessing justice being served with dignity and grace. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, the judge announced. Metropolitan Corporate Holdings is hereby ordered to revise their hiring practices under court supervision. Furthermore, they will establish a fund of $5 million to compensate previously rejected qualified candidates. The woman's shoulders slumped, but not from the loss of the case. Something deeper was shifting inside her. A realization that had been building all day. She watched as the judge continued to outline the terms of the ruling, his commitment to fairness unwavering despite how she had treated him. Additionally, he added, the company will implement a comprehensive diversity training program for all executives and hiring managers. At these words, several people in the gallery glanced meaningfully at the woman. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As the judge gathered his papers, a young law clerk approached him with a question. The woman watched their interaction, the judge treating the young clerk with the same respect he showed to everyone, regardless of their position or background. It was a stark contrast to her own behavior that morning. The courtroom began to empty, but the woman remained seated, lost in thought. Her associate touched her arm gently. We should go. We need to inform the company board about the ruling. But she barely heard him. Instead, she was remembering the judge's composure on the train, his dignity in the face of her prejudice, and his absolute professionalism throughout the trial. He had taught her more in one day than all her years of corporate diversity seminars ever had. As she finally stood to leave, she overheard two law students discussing the case. "Did you see how fair he was?" one whispered. "Even after what happened on the train, he never once let it affect his judgment. That's what real integrity looks like." The woman paused at the courtroom doors, turning back for one last look. The judge was still at his bench, reviewing cases for the next day. The same man she had refused to sit next to that morning had just changed her company's future, and perhaps her own perspective, forever. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around civil rights lawyers who were celebrating the verdict. The late afternoon sun caught the building's facade, making the words "equal justice under law" shine brightly above the entrance. Those words held new meaning for her now. That evening, as she rode the train home, standing this time, she noticed things she'd never paid attention to before, the diverse mix of passengers, each with their own stories, their own dignities. Her designer suit didn't feel like armor anymore. It felt more like a reminder of how little clothing really tells about a person's character. The judge's ruling had cost her company millions, but the real price had been paid in her own understanding. Sometimes the most expensive lessons aren't the ones that cost money, they're the ones that cost us our prejudices.